Hi, my name is Mindy Sutherland, and I am doing Chapter 8 on behaviorism and behavioral learning theory. So, the goal of behaviorism is to study human behavior. That is done by looking at the environment and presenting stimuli, as well as seeing how human development impacts that. The behaviors must be observable and measurable, predictable and controlled, and there must be a response to the stimuli. So, behaviorism has a lot of influence in how it developed. There are two scientists, Pavlov and Watson, that worked on classical conditioning. And then we also have B.F. Skinner, who figured out operant conditioning. We also have social behaviorism and social cognitive theories, as well as radical behaviorism versus social behaviorism. And I will discuss all of these in the presentation. Okay, so talking about Pavlov and Watson, we're going to be talking about classical conditioning. So Pavlov did the study with the dogs and the saliva with the bell. So if you don't remember, or if you haven't heard about this study, the unconditioned stimulus is the meat and the unconditional response is the saliva. So dogs automatically will salivate when there's meat in front of them. So he introduces a bell to this situation and connects the bell with the meat, making it a neutral stimulus. And then, if he does this enough times with the meat and the bell together, he eventually removes the meat and does just the bell ringing, and the dog has a conditioned response to salivate to the sound of the bell. That was Pavlov's experiment. Now we have Watson, who did a study with a white rat and an infant child. And that was not so ethical now. That wouldn't be something that we would be able to redo in today's society. And he does get a lot of criticism for that fact. But he has a rat and he introduces a loud noise. And he brings the loud noise and the rat together, and eventually just seeing the rat alone scares the child. So there's obviously ethical concerns with that. But both of these studies are classical conditioning studies, and I have two videos that you can watch to help you better understand classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and they go over the studies that Pavlov and Watson have done. Okay, so we're going to talk about B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning. So B.F. Skinner was really scientific in the way that he chose to look at behaviorism. And he has a famous study where he studies rats, and he creates these contraptions that have a green light and a red light and a lever, as well as a floor that can electrocute the mice, and a place where food comes in. So using these rats, they use positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So when talking about positive and negative, it's not in the same connotation as what we know as positive and negative. Positive is to add or put something into the situation. In that case, for B.F. Skinner, he was either putting in food or he was putting in a shock. And then negative is to take something away from the situation. So, continuing on, as far as reinforcement and punishment is concerned, reinforcement is when you want something to happen more often, and punishment is when you want something to happen less often. So when we're talking about positive reinforcement in regards to Skinner's research, he had a green light on and would give the mouse food when they pressed the lever. So he was inputting food into the situation because he wanted the mouse to press the lever when the green light was on. So that's positive reinforcement. So if we're talking about positive punishment, when the red light was on and the mouse pressed the lever, the mouse or rat would get an electrical shock. So he was still putting in the positive part of it, which is the shock, but it was the punishment because the mouse was hitting the lever during the red light. So negative reinforcement of this situation as well is this loud noise that he had in the cage. And when the mouse pressed on the lever, the noise would stop. So he took away the loud noise. And that was the negative part of the negative reinforcement, taking away the loud noise. So operant condition reinforcements must follow response. So it must be immediately after the response. And it must be paired. Socio-behaviorism and social cognitive theories. This was a shift from operant conditioning, and the thing was that it's not distinguishing individuals from isolated behaviors. So that was the problem that people were having with behaviorism, is that there wasn't a lot of individualism involved, and the environment and the dynamics weren't really being looked at enough. And so then social cognitive theories emerged. Okay, so there's radical behaviorism versus social behaviorism. And when we're thinking about radical behaviorists, we think about Skinner because he was very scientific in the way that he observed things and the way he did his research. He didn't think that feelings and thinking were things that could be observed, so he didn't think they were relevant to behavior. And then we have social behaviorists like Chomsky who believe that there are complex influences on behavior, including environment, gestures, and language. So social behaviorists, they feel that responses may or may not directly be related to the environment as well as mental state of mind, and that there may be other factors involved with the behavior that need to be addressed as well. Okay, so when we're talking about the actual research that takes place with behavioral learning theory, there are 4 different formats that really are prevalent in this type of research. So there's direct observation, which is usually recorded, or there's a lot of note taking or checklists involved. It's very time consuming and labor intensive, and it can be subjective. The second one is a self-report. So self-reports are when participants are allowed to contribute in the collection of data. So this may be like how many times you brush your teeth a day, or some sort of action that they keep track of, or behavior that they keep track of, and then they report that to the researcher. The third are interviews, and interviews are great because they can give you an abundance of data. The only issue is that they are time consuming, and they can be subjective depending on the coding that is used and how well that works out. The fourth one is questionnaires, and questionnaires are pretty common because they are quick and easy, and the data collection is really transparent and it aligns well with the with how it's coded. Okay, so some of the instruments and assessments that are associated with behaviorism are listed here. So there's 4 that we're going to talk about quickly. There is the functional behavior assessment. So this is used in an educational setting, and it looks at problematic behavior, and then you go and you have multiple observations of that behavior. You look at what's happening before and what's happening after, and then with all of that information, you come up with an intervention plan. The Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire is also used in educational settings, and this looks at prior knowledge of students, well, or it can look at anyone, not just students. And this collects the data, and then there's two sections, the motivation section and the learning strategies section. So this can help the instructor figure out where a student may or may not be deficient or excelling. There is the Rokich value scale, Rokich, I want to say. I may be saying that wrong. So this is used in a variety of settings, not just educational settings, and it determines the attitudes and behaviors associated with values. So there's 18 terminal values and there are 18 instrumental values, and then the participant has to scale those values based on what's most important to them. And then this also is interesting because it can provide a connection to the consumption habits and leisure of the participant as well. Like you can see what's important to them, which may not be something that you can see in other assessments. And then lastly, the Defining Issues Test, the DIT. This is based off of Lawrence Kohlberg's moral judgment interview. So there are four components that are determined in this DIT. It is a multiple response to moral dilemmas, and there's moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, and moral character. The only issue with this is that it is advanced with the reading, and it's really hard for younger children to understand. And it does not measure stage 1, which most of the younger children are in. So that may or may not be applicable. Okay, so behavioral learning theory has really focused more on the individual rather than multiple people. But they are starting to look at like a population level, and they can see the similarities in behaviors at a population level as well. And behavioral learning theory, when using this, it's the teachers are more the center of the learning rather than it being a student-centered learning. So it's more of a direct instruction model when it comes to behavioral theory in the classroom. There's also more emphasis on response rather than the way the response was obtained. So when you think about like memorization and remembering and like repetition, that's where that emphasis is on in behaviorism. So it's not so much on how you got the knowledge, it's whether or not you have the knowledge. Okay, so there are criticisms like I've been talking about throughout this whole presentation. I just want to talk about them a little bit more. The thing is that there's constraints on behaviorism because a lot of the research that's been done has been done on animals, not necessarily on humans. And it's not bringing in the critical thinking that humans have. And environment is limited too. It doesn't explain why behaviors are being seen. It just tells you that the behavior is being seen. So there's not a reason behind it. And there's also a focus on the rewards and punishment, and that can have an impact on motivation as we talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And you may not be able to maintain the attention of students using this theory. There are also other factors to consider when responses are given. So if a response is given, there may be other things like test anxiety or the development that's at play that is not necessarily addressed in behavioral learning theory. And the amount of recognition that some students received as to other students that may or may not be receiving the same amount of recognition or lack thereof recognition or punishment, whatever it may be, you just want to be fair in your classroom. And if you're not showing the same attention to all students, there may be some emotional harm done in that. Okay, so behaviorism is a great tool for educators because it can help predict and control certain behaviors, and it can can help with classroom management. And I mean, we've all heard about classroom management, and there are certain tools that behaviorism can help us to use in the classroom. It's a matter of using strategies that also work for you as an educator and for your classroom and the students as well. There's behavior modification, assertive discipline, positive classroom discipline, and logical consequences. There's you have to think about how you want to set up your classroom management as opposed to discipline, system, and instruction, because there's 3 different levels of classroom management and how behaviorism will influence those. You also want to think about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation with your students, because if you're giving positive reinforcement such as stickers, are they doing it for themselves or are they doing it for the sticker? Is something that you need to ask yourself, and how that's impacting the students' learning. I hope that you were able to take away some new knowledge with this presentation, and I also have some critical questions as well that will help you expand on that knowledge. Thank you.